Good day to everyone. You're listening to the podcast of Studio Central and Eastern Europe at KU Leuven. My name is Stephan Parmentier. I'm a professor of criminology and human rights at the Faculty of Law and Criminology at KU Leuven and specialized in serious violations of human rights and how to deal with them through transitional justice. Today we welcome a guest from Colombia. Mr. José Fernando Serrano-Amaya is with us. Welcome to the podcast. Bienvenido. And I'm going to briefly introduce him first. José Fernando has studied anthropology at the Universidad Nacional in Colombia, in Bogotá, and also conflict resolution in Bradford in the UK, and has finished a PhD at the School of Education and Social Work at the University of Sydney, Australia. His work is mostly focused on transitional justice issues and on human rights in general, with a specific focus on sexual identity and gender, of course within the broader context of transitional justice in his home country. So maybe first question to you, José. How would you briefly position yourself as an academic, and what kinds of fields have you been working, and what brought you to that particular point?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Stephan, for the introduction. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you here in this podcast. I would say that my work is an intersection between academic work, activism, and also I have had some duties as a public employee in Colombia. Therefore, my approach to these topics is not just from the knowledge production in terms of theory building, academic research. I've been also working in the application of this, and mostly from the perspective of supporting social organizations and social movements in their claims for their rights and in their work for social justice. Mm-hmm. So I've been always combining the production of knowledge that is useful for social justice reasons, but also using the knowledge that is produced in activism as a tool, not only for policies, but also for theory building. Mm-hmm. So I'm very much interested in those connections. And I think the topic of transitional justice, peace building, is a topic that often needs that connection. Mm-hmm. In my work in the university, I'm coordinating a master on peace building, and I'm very much interested in how students can apply their knowledge in their professional work, but also the experience that some of the students bring to the university as the work they do could be also helpful to challenge and to expand the theory work that we do. Yeah. So I'm very much interested in expanding those fields.
Okay. That sounds like a very interesting interaction. You seem a good example of what we call these days a pracademic, practitioner academic who makes the connections between both and has one leg in one area and another in another area and tries to combine both and also instruct and encourage students to do similar activities. Okay, thank you very much. Well, we are here today to talk a bit about your work, of course, on transitional justice. And for the sake of clarity for the audience, maybe it's good to briefly introduce the notion of transitional justice. In essence, it's all about dealing with the past in order to construct the future, one could say. The past, of course, of human rights violations, often very serious human rights violations that have been committed, violations like crimes against humanity in the form of torture or slavery or disappearances. Or even genocide is, of course, often called within the ambit of transitional justice. It is a term that has emerged, let's say, in the 1990s only, because at that time the world was changing with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the transitions in Eastern and Central Europe, and then in other parts of the world. I still remember the transition in South Africa, of course, from apartheid to democracy. And at the same time, actually in the same month, also the genocide in Rwanda started to take place. So all of these types of activities are subsumed under the heading of transitional justice. Today, it has expanded to such a notion as to say, well, whatever kind of serious and massive human rights violations that take place in a particular country, can also be seen through the lens of transitional justice. For example, the situation in Canada with the residential schools that some will have heard about. The idea that indigenous children were taken away from their families, were put in schools under the auspices of religious congregations. And that double violation of human rights, one could say, of taking away children on the one hand, but often also abusing them morally, physically, sexually in those schools. Although Canada is not an authoritarian state, has hardly been one for the past 150 years, but still this kind of government policy is now also seen under the heading of transitional justice. In the field of TJ, as we often abbreviate it, one could identify a number of pillars or mechanisms. It often starts with criminal prosecutions against those mostly responsible for the violations committed. Then there is, of course, a major space for truth commissions or other forms of truth-telling. Truth commissions where mostly the production of facts and figures and the experience of victims are central. Victim reparation programs are, of course, also part of the transitional justice agenda. And those programs can deal with financial compensation for the crimes or the violations committed, but often also the restitution of property, the restitution of rights, the rehabilitation measures that are being imposed or produced for victims to become members of society again. And then symbolic measures like public spaces that are renamed or public holidays or apologies even by state authorities or other actors involved in the violation of human rights. And not to forget, obviously, the future institutional reforms in order to try to avoid similar or identical violations or crimes taking place in the future. And the fifth pillar, in fact, is increasingly emerging as one centered around memory, I would say, memory building, how to construct the memory of the past, or maybe one should say memories in plural, and that's one of our points of discussion, I'm sure, in order to build common ground for the society and the population and the specific groups in that population into the future. So with this very brief overview, I would like to ask you, Jose, which kind of pillar or mechanism have you been most closely associated with? Could you tell us a little bit about your work in one or more of those pillars?
Thank you, Stephan, for such a great introduction. I would like to start saying that we're having this conversation in a very unique moment for Colombia because we are having waves of violence that we were not expecting to have after the 2016 peace agreement. And this is important to realize because we imagine that transitional justice is something like there is a past that is gone and a future that is new and with new expectations. But the reality in many countries is that the post-conflict or the after a peace negotiation could in fact create new waves of violence. Therefore, there isn't a linear, progressive evolution in the context of conflict. In fact, there is often an overlap between what was, let's say, the past and a new future that not always means that the conflict is disappear. Mm-hmm. In fact, it could imply that in the after, there will be new forms of violence that are not expected. And that's what is happening now in Colombia. Mm-hmm. And I would like to start mentioning that because the signing of the 2016 peace agreement was a moment of much hope, indeed, but it doesn't mean that all the violence or all the forms of criminality disappear. In fact, we're now facing new forms of that. So transitional justice is like a promise of a future that will be different than the past, but sometimes they overlap. Mm-hmm. That's the first idea. The second idea is in the pillars that you have mentioned, I've been working in at least 3 of them that in fact can go to what I said before. In the case of Colombia, working with victims has been done years before the signing of the peace agreement. And that's very important because we often imagine that, like with the idea of transitional justice, there is some kind of conflict resolution moment, there is a signing of agreement, and therefore a new thing starts, like working with victims, memory work, institutional reforms. But in the case of Colombia, several of these pillars of transitional justice were happening years before the signing of peace agreement, most of the time
led by community organizations. And I would like to stress that because in the areas in which I work, issues like truth commissions were done by social organizations. For example, women organization in Colombia, feminist organizations, they were doing truth commissions since the mid-90s because they wanted to denounce and to document and to make visible the kind of violence they were facing in the middle of the conflict. So this is important to realize because, in fact, memory work has been also a kind of activity that most of the time has been done by social movements with their own resources, with their own ways to understand stuff, years before institutional reforms, years before it became an issue for the state or for transitional justice instruments. So this is also interesting because, in fact, these 5 pillars that you mentioned, they are not like starting from zero at a certain moment. They may have different histories, they may have different moments of evolution and different progress. In my case, for example, I've been working with victims of conflict for quite a while, years before the signing of any peace agreement. I've been part of several activist organizations, especially since the 90s, early 2000s, in which we were documenting the violence that was happening against LGBT people in Colombia. Years before that, we could imagine that there could be a peace agreement. And in the early 2000s, we were already working in how to connect the agendas of LGBT organizations with the agendas of peace movements in the country. And that happened many years before that. We even had the wars to talk about transitional justice, truth commissions, etc. But we were already doing that work in terms of working with victims, working for their rights, documenting issues of violence, and pushing the state to recognize that those kind of violence were happening. Because in fact, one of the biggest issues in transitional justice is that for many years there is denial of what is happening.
Yes.
And transitional justice is a very useful instrument to make visible these situations. But it doesn't mean that the visibility of those situations appear with them. It may be happening years before with that. So I've been working in issues of memory work, especially in a topic, issues of gender and sexuality are, let's say, one of the most difficult topics to deal in political conflicts. There is always silence about that. This is just basically something that happens in the private. It has taken a while for transitional justice instruments to recognize the central role of gender and sexual violence in political conflict. So it's not nowadays. This is something that we already realized, but it took a while to make it that so central. I've been also working in the Truth Commission, particularly supporting the writing of the chapter on gender and sexual violence against women and LGBT communities. I had a role supporting the writing of that piece of document. And I want to mention that because that's one of the many novelties that the Colombian case have had. Colombia has a lot to teach to the world, has learned a lot as well from previous processes of transitional justice, and it's been the place where several innovations are happening. I want to emphasize how rich, diverse, and complex is the field of transitional justice. It's a field in which we have not only the work of lawyers, as you mentioned, in the pillar of prosecution of criminal, but it's also a field where you have lots of professionals and the energy that you will find from social movements fighting for the rights. And that's a core idea that we shouldn't forget when we think about transitional justice, because that sometimes it sounds like a field of some experts, lawyers discussing very complicated stuff. But in fact, behind transitional justice, there are people with concrete lives, with experiences that they want to really live in dignity. Because transitional justice is an instrument to have a life in dignity.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, it's really interesting that you say all of these things, and out of your personal experience, I would say, because you stress the dynamic character of transitional justice, which is, of course, a notion that has been developed and relates to a reality, but often a reality that is seen as linear, as top-down, from the state to society and not the other way around. And emphasizing the role of communities, of non-state actors in general, I think is really important. Also, the fact that these developments are not linear. They're not linear in history and they're not linear in reality. So the open-ended character, basically, of transitional justice efforts. And as you were saying, sometimes countries are sliding back to violence or to conflict. So there's no guarantee that things will always go better and will always become more democratic and more inclusive. Maybe this is a good moment to talk a little bit about the link with Central and Eastern Europe, because you were talking about the, let's say, the lessons that Colombia could offer to the world, or the sharing of experiences from the Colombian context. So Central and Eastern Europe, of course, have had their own developments in transitional justice. Let's briefly refer to various components and types of transitions. Let's say the Velvet Revolution, as it was called in Czechoslovakia, the fairly easy transitions in Poland and Hungary, maybe, but then also the violent transition that has taken place in the Balkan countries of ex-Yugoslavia. So depending on the type of transition, you have more emphasis on prosecutions, like in Bosnia and Serbia and Croatia, or lustration elements, which is another mechanism of transitional justice, whereby persons in public office are being ousted or are not being allowed to serve any longer or to serve anew in public positions because they have been associated with the authoritarianism and even the repression of the past. Also, memory building is very prominent in many countries in Central and Eastern Europe, not only in the Baltic countries, but also in the Czech Republic and Poland. So it is interesting to see how certain mechanisms of transitional justice have been used more and others less in Central Eastern Europe, depending on the type of transition that has taken place, and of course the choices that have been made by the political and the cultural elites at the time. Now today, Eastern Europe, of course, is facing another major challenge, a major conflict with Ukraine, as part of the aggression by its neighboring country. So there's a lot of change over time, historic change in the 1990s, but also recent change. How would you try to see the connection with Colombia? What could Colombia offer in its experience of its very long-term and complicated violent past to some of these countries in Central and Eastern Europe?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that question, Stephan. First of all, I would like to say that I'm here because of an invitation of Marina Chetsova, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Faculty of Political Science. And the reason I'm here is because we've been having this conversation in terms of how can we support each other, and I'm talking about Colombians and Ukrainians, in this particular situation, knowing that the conflicts are very different. Mm-hmm. There is no reason to compare the conflicts because they come from different histories, different situations, but we may face similar situations that can be a space for conversation. You were mentioning before the pillars of transitional justice, and one of them is working with victims. Victims need to be repaired, they need to be protected, and Colombia has a long tradition of knowing how to work with victims, developing institutional strategies to deal with that, policies, etc. We have a very complex and rich institutionality dealing with the rights of victims. So that's one of the cases in which we can, let's say, hear each other. I wouldn't say that we are the case to follow. That would be wrong because there is no example that should be considered like the formula to be replicated in other cases. That would be a wrong approach to that. But we can have conversations. And in the case of victims, for example, there is lots of stuff that we can learn. And we've been working with Marina in topics like the important role of documentation for the post-conflict moment. Because in fact, most of the issues that you are talking about in transitional justice, like memory work, for example, they depend on right documentation. And most of the time, in the moment of the conflict, we don't think about the importance of recording, documenting, having observatories of what is happening, and collecting enough information that will be useful in the moment that we are reaching some kind of transitional justice instruments. I would say that the biggest impact that a transitional justice instruments can have depend on how strong it is in terms of evidence, in terms of having good documentation. Therefore, during the conflict even, we can start collecting information about it. And the third point I would say could be already a way to connect both countries is in the role of the diaspora. We were discussing before that in the case of Colombia, diaspora has been a key actor not only during the process of the conflict, but in the post-conflict, in the peace agreement, and in the transitional justice moment. In fact, in the report of the Colombian Truth Commission, there is a whole chapter on diaspora, not only to understand why people leave, but also how they have been key actors for peace building, even if they are in different countries. Mm-hmm. So this is just to mention some of the different areas in which we can have conversations between the two countries. And I would like to also finish this with the role of universities. It is important to acknowledge that universities during the conflict or in the transitional justice moment, we are key actors, not only in the production of knowledge, but also in terms of keeping the everyday life. Nowadays in Ukraine, universities are a key actor in keeping that idea of there is a sense of life that has the possibility of hope, basically. Mm-hmm. I could say that universities are the space for hope in the middle of the conflict and obviously in the transitional justice moment. So this is to say that there are many things that we can learn from each other, and that's what we're trying to do with our colleagues from Ukraine now.
That sounds really fascinating, yeah. And also to see universities and academic work in general as a way not only to produce knowledge, but also to allow practice to take place. So like the strongholds, let's say, of independent thinking at the same time of practice-related work, yes, despite difficult circumstances, because in the midst of a war situation, this is far from evident, of course. Yeah. You were talking before about the role of non-governmental organizations and particularly victim-driven groups, let's say. Do you see connections with Ukraine as well?
I think that's something that needs to be explored. There is this tendency to kind of focus in certain directions when we are dealing with conflicts. So somehow European countries tend to look at their neighbors as the first way to establish a conversation, which makes sense. So obviously, maybe there might be more connections with Ukrainians, with France, Belgium, and less connections with Latin America. Mm-hmm. It's important also to have a north-south conversations and also learning from each other in these ways. I would say that civil society organizations, even if they are very diverse, can learn from each other when we think about each other as peers in dealing with certain situations, even if we may have very different cultural and political backgrounds. I would say that universities can play a key role in facilitating these conversations, because somehow universities could be also the space in which grassroots organizations can encounter each other, and universities can play that field of an open space in which social organizations that never imagined that they could have something in common can get together and exchange ideas.
Yes, that sounds very interesting indeed, yeah. Okay, well, I hope this podcast is being disseminated widely and that we have a wide audience to learn about these aspects and to engage with them. And I would like to thank you so much, dear Jose, for your very instructive talk and a very interesting exchange, I would say, that always helps us to increase our understanding and our empathy also with particularly the victims of these human rights violations. Because let's not forget that transitional justice should also be people-centered and victim-centered in particular. So thank you so much again, and hope to see you next time.
Okay. Thank you for the invitation.